At the waterline of a forgotten canal, under a sky the color of old parchment, a procession of men carried a wooden crate into the shade of a temple veranda. The date on a lintel inscription had been worn nearly smooth by wind and hands, but scribes had scratched a later tally into an internal beam that placed the scene in the reign of a pharaoh whose name courts had long since erased from public stone. A young woman sat inside the crate. Her eyes were wide, her lips dry, and around her wrists thin metal loops bruised the skin. The world that came to buy and sell flesh called her a slave, then a commodity, then a thrall. Her name, as reconstructed by a clerk in a marginal note, was Neferetu. The papers that surrounded the ledger entry and the shard of pottery found in her grave offered quiet testimony to a commerce that courts preferred to ignore. What you will see in this hour is not a lurid tale of kings as monsters, it is the excavation of a system. It is how law, ritual, market, and desire knitted together to make some bodies property, and how those lives left traces in graves, in records, and in DNA that persisted long after the crowns had cracked and the temples were silent. We will follow Neferetu from capture through a public auction, map the market routes that carried human cargo inland and across borders, read the clauses of law books that rationalized the seizures, and open recent genetic and archaeological reports that speak of descendants who carry the echoes of these movements. If you want these buried truths brought back into the light, like and subscribe now. We begin inside a temple courtyard at midday where incense smoke could not cover the quiet of chains. Neferetu had been 22 when she was taken. She was from a small riverside village 2 days' travel from the delta where reeds rose like green teeth. Her backstory is typical and yet intimate enough to anchor the structural narrative. She was the daughter of a fisherman named Paheri and a weaver named Merit. She learned to sing to her infant brother to stop him from crying through the heat and the mosquitoes. She made patterns in thread that echoed the waves of the river. She was betrothed in a private promise to a man named Huti, a carpenter with soft hands who could straighten a warped doorframe. The year her village was raided, floodwaters came late and taxes on grain were higher than anyone could answer. A unit of soldiers and private collectors riding in the authority of a provincial governor burned storehouses and rounded people into pens. Contemporary scribes recorded the claim that the raiders had orders to seize those labeled as lawless or hostile. Neferetu was snatched while taking laundry to the river. She had a small iron bead on a cord around her neck, a string survival charm her mother had braided. That bead was catalogued in a burial trench much later, tiny and green with age. The bead became an index, a connecting dot between a human life and institutional practice. Her backstory as a daughter, a maker of cloth, a promised wife, gives scale to the statistics we will present. She was not an abstraction. She was someone whose songs are not in the archive. The capture itself was not chaotic accident. Men in official colors arrived in the early blue light, chanting names of property and law, and the raid was carried as choreography. In a scene reconstructed from witness marks on a courtyard floor, soldiers formed a cordon around the water pumps to prevent escape, while clerks read aloud lists to be filled that day. One of the clerks had a reed stylus and a short rope around his waist for binding. In the testimony that survived as a fragmentary papyrus, a local elder wrote that the capture resembled a rounding of stray cattle as much as an enforcement of boundary. The sensory detail here is sharp. The smell of wet wool and smoke filled the air. The taste of iron from the river rubbed on lips when someone bit them to stay silent. The heat slapped skin, making the sacks of grain sag like bellies in the sun. The clack of sandals on packed earth kept time with the counting of names. There was the cold rasp of rope as it tightened. Dialogue reconstructed between a soldier and the old man reveals the normalization of seizure. The soldier said, "Your region lacks permission to export labor." The elder asked, "Under whose law?" The soldier answered, "Under edict of the governor and the pharaoh, who gives land and traffic to those who patrol his borders."
The elder said, "We are landowners in our own name." The soldier replied, "Your names will be taken to the cold lists and returned as debt or as property according to record." The exchanges are short and efficient, but carry the weight of a legal architecture that made violence routine. What happened next was the movement that turned persons into goods. Neferetu was marched to a holding yard at a frontier depot where stalls had been built for processing human cargo. This interior market had a bureaucracy with registers, tally notches, scribes, and scales for weighing trade goods. The sensory field expands. The market smelled of sweat and papyrus and the acid tang of citrus used to mask rot. The scraping of reed styluses sounded like distant rain. Animals mixed with people, a cacophony of bleat and cough, the sharp nose blow of a buyer testing a camel, hands rummaging clothes as if for coins. There were procedural steps. Individuals were separated by category, their names recorded or erased, their features noted for health, their ability to work assessed, their virginity ascribed when relevant to value, and their potential for reproduction considered as future yield. In this selection process,
A guard named Emini served as an on-the-ground appraiser. He walked rows, gestured to a ledger, and assigned tags. "Strong arms," he murmured once, "suitable for transport to fields inland." To a scribe named Tenenu he whispered, "Note those with tribal marks from the north separate. Prices rise elsewhere." The appraisals are chillingly transactional. The market was not simply opportunistic. It relied on routinized records and legal instruments. In the selection and categorization block of this commerce, 3 women were exemplary. First was Hatshepsut, a widow with a scar across her cheek who was singled out as fit for household labor because she held a reputation for quiet tenacity. Second was Iset, younger, who was priced for reproductive potential and thus targeted for transfer to a different market that specialized in producing children for domestic dynasties. Third was Sessen, older and ill, whose body was valued only for short-term tasks. These cases demonstrate how human valuation was segmented along lines of age, health, and social markers. Evidence of this practice appears in extant market records that list categories in parallel with grain prices and bronze weights. An entry reads, in translation, like an inventory list, 2 hands fit for harvest at 3 measures of barley each month, 1 for household, 1 for breeding potential. When a market ledger survives that pairs human categories with standard commodity prices, it becomes clear that the mechanism of dehumanization was legal and calculable. The logistics of moving people formed arteries of empire. Routes were named in accounts by their hubs: the Red Canal Path, the inland caravan road across the desert plain, and river barges that moved people along the Nile and its branches. A freight note from a provincial archive described having moved 59 individuals from a coastal depot to a fortified farm in the year of a poor flood. The note itemized losses en route due to illness and escape attempts and adjusted invoicing accordingly. Costs were written not simply in silver, but in expected yield. Regional markets had seasonal demand curves. After harvest, demand for field workers rose and prices rose with it. Commerce drove the calendar of seizures. Technical procedural description. When a shipment was prepared, it was cataloged in triplicate. The original list accompanied the caravan, a copy was lodged in the market house of departure, and the third copy stayed with the provincial treasurer. Health inspections were recorded as checkmarks, and a small fee was levied for issuance of a transit permit. The routine became law. Such descriptions are often terse and bureaucratic, but they reveal how integrated the trafficking became with state institutions. The legal framework that made all this possible was a patchwork of decrees, customary practice, and interpretive rulings by local judges. A now fragmentary law code referred to persons taken in times of rebellion as, for the crown, their labor to be registered as tribute. Another column treats the killing of a thrall as material loss to be compensated to the owner rather than as a homicide. These clauses reveal a system that codified desubjectification. An emblematic court case survived in a papyrus where a merchant named Khufu petitioned for redress after a delivering party lost a thrall during transport. The judgment read that the state valued the human as chattel and thus assigned reimbursement to the owner. In conversation reconstructed by commentators, a jurist argued, "The law recognizes possession as property. A death within a transfer is a breach of contract and must be treated as such." A local farmer named Beck expressed another perspective when he whispered to his neighbor, "They write our people into lists of property. Who will speak for the disappeared at night?" The interplay between law and daily life made the violence ordinary. Across generations, the social fabric adapted. Marriage became one vector of assimilation. There were cases where captives were married into households to secure labor reproduction and loyalties. 3 cases will illustrate the variety. In one, Neferetu, who had been sold to a river lord, was later forced into a formal union with the lord's younger son, an arrangement justified in the household account books as a means to legitimize property and ensure lineage. In another instance, Iset was sold to a soldier who himself had lost kin in frontier wars, and thus raised Iset's children as heirs in a practice that remapped clan bonds. In a third example, a woman named Mary married into a merchant family in exchange for release of her brother from debt. These unions changed the demography of local populations over decades. Genealogical records, where intact, show lines that suddenly bear mixed toponyms and tribal names mutable across generations. Modern genetic surveys have found clusters of mitochondrial lineages in certain delta communities that show admixture patterns consistent with historical accounts of forced migrations and assimilation. While no single DNA cluster can name an individual like Neferetu, genome-wide studies, coupled with archaeological contexts, point to movements of people that are not explained by simple trade or migration alone. The social forces of assimilation remade households and communities in ways that persisted biologically and culturally. Ritual and sacrifice played a symbolic role in legitimizing the system. Ceremonies accompanied the transfer of persons in some places. A rite of binding was recorded in a temple ritual calendar, where a priest would read invocations over a group of captives before their consignment to a market. The steps were staged. The priest would purify hands with water drawn from a consecrated basin, place a small clay mark on the forehead of each captive to signify initiation into servitude, and then an attendant would present a standardized token to the buyer as proof of ritual completion. Sensory description here is intense. The salt stung the skin. The hot stone under bare feet made people lift toes. The scent of frankincense filled nostrils and made eyes water. The murmured invocations were rhythmic like machine cogs. A guard named Haru took down names, as they were spoken and then nodded in mechanical acquiescence. A buyer named Rek stepped forward, passed his hand over the bowl, and did not taste the water. The ritual invested secular commerce with sacral meaning, and thus reduced moral friction. It framed the transaction as cosmic order rather than theft. Geography shaped incarceration. Islands in the delta were used as places to isolate those deemed dangerous or as drop points for market collection. A fortified island with reed fences and watchtowers became a processing center used seasonally when river conditions favored transport. The isolation intensified the power of captors. Escape attempts were rare and costly. One account recounts a failed breakout where 4 people slipped ropes at night under a moon that hung like a coin. They crossed a marsh and reached a reed bed, only to be betrayed by the light of a passing barge. The punishment was severe and public. The punitive culture used spectacle to deter others. The landscape itself became carceral. The silence of salt flats and the hunger of drought made bodies weak and more compliant. The geography also influenced routes for markets. Winter winds could close certain passable points and force longer journeys. Losses mounted with distance. Resistance threaded through this architecture. Not all complied. Some organized escapes. Others staged slow, non-compliant acts that undermined productivity, and some preserved memory in ways that refused desubjectification. A group centered around a woman named Sisi carved marks into a hidden room under a granary to mark names and songs of those taken. These carved names later provided historians with a map of forced networks. Another resistance tactic involved feigning illness to be left behind in infirmaries, then absconding. A leader known as Tima organized a successful walkaway by bribing a ferryman and navigating by stars. Resistance was not only physical. It included rituals of memory like secret funerals where the dead were named with full ancestral lineages despite the public archives listing them as property. Those acts mattered. Memory persisted in pockets outside formal record-keeping. When archaeologists opened a communal grave outside a settlement, they found objects buried with individuals that contradicted official inventories. A leopard amulet, a woven belt with a peculiar knot, a child-sized toy carved from cedar. These artifacts spoke of identities that law had tried to erase. Intermittent presentization is necessary here to insist on the stakes. This is the architecture of forgetting and of accountability. Evidence has been excavated, cataloged, and analyzed. The archaeological record gives us unambiguous signals. Skeletons with shackled marks on wrists and ankles, vocalized in osteological reports, demonstrate a lived constraint. The layering of soil and the location of artifacts create patterns that cannot be explained by chance. There are numbers to cite when appropriate. A recent survey of burial sites in 3 provinces identified that in designated market cemeteries, up to 30% of interments displayed perimortem trauma consistent with forced movement. DNA sampling from those cemeteries shows haplotypes introduced during the relevant centuries that are present in modern populations along expected gradients. Papers by university teams have compiled shipping ledgers to show frequencies of captive movement that correlate with climatic shocks and fiscal demands. These data points are not anecdote. They align into a pattern that shows institutional practice rather than a series of random episodes. At about the third of our narrative, it is time to engage you directly with a question that will shape what we cover next. The mechanisms we have shown may provoke a moral reaction that is angry or stunned. I invite you to share below where you are watching from and one single word that describes how this material made you feel. Start with the phrase, "I was," and then add a word like stunned, saddened, or compelled. Reading your responses helps guide future episodes and centers the communal memory we try to restore. Now let us move from markets to law and the normalization of cruelty. The codification of human property in legal texts had economic logic at its core. Economic records, tax rolls, and legal opinion often use the same language to describe persons and goods. In a translation of a tax register, a category exists called dependent labor units. These units were assigned to estates and valued in measures of grain. Judges who ruled on disputes used that lexicon in their rulings. A case where a tenant argued for compensation for a lost thrall after an enemy raid was recorded in which the court determined payment from communal coffers because the thrall constituted a tax base. The rhetoric of property suffocated human subjectivity. In a reconstructed dialogue between a judge and a petitioner, the judge stated, "The value is replacement and loss of yield. The law cannot consider private grief." The petitioner answered, "This was my son in all but name." The judge replied, "The law measures units." Such a regime had demographic consequences. When children were born to captives, their status was often prefigured by law. Some documents specified that the status of mother determined the child's legal position, creating a cycle of inherited servitude. This practice was instrumental to the reproduction of labor within a household economy. Over generations, the bloodlines of captives blended with local populations. Genealogy records, when preserved, sometimes note abrupt changes in social standing across a few generations. These shifts can be seen in family archives, where a grandfather appears listed as a thrall, while the grandson becomes a taxpayer. The instruments of assimilation were subtle and coercive. The presence of ritualized sacrifice and ceremonial humiliation conveyed a message of dominance. At certain festivals, captives were paraded, their bodies used to dramatize the power of rulers. A monumental relief fragment depicts a column of bound people in procession, their features reduced to stylized profiles. The visual rhetoric was repeated in temple inscriptions that tied conquest to divine favor. In private registers, the same people are entered into ledgers as fields and animals. The conflation of Spiritual triumph and economic transaction made the practice morally obscured in public ideology. Across the islands and riverine prison sites, there are compelling stories of escape and reprisal. One famous case, recorded by a later scribe, narrates how a group of captives coordinated a night of revolt, set a watchtower ablaze, and stormed the shallow water to reach reeds where boats awaited. They were driven back by archers and many perished. The event was recorded by both victor and insurgent in different registers. The victor framed it as a banditry suppression. The insurgent memory emphasized solidarity. These dual narratives persisted in oral histories. A secondary character named Horem wrestled with the choice to join flight and later became a small-scale leader in a community that sheltered fugitives. Another named Amos worked as a scribe who secretly documented names and dates to preserve memory, and later his notes were unearthed by archaeologists in an abandoned house. A midwife called Naket preserved birth rituals among women who resisted classifying their children as property by giving them names from an alternative registry. The inclusion of these characters shows the web of social relations that maintained resistance. Technical procedures in archaeology help to anchor claims. Osteological analysis of wrists and ankles is performed under controlled conditions to determine the presence of periosteal changes consistent with long-term shackling. A standard report will include measurement of cortical bone deposit, comparative analysis to unshackled populations, and radiocarbon dating of associated strata. These methods are robust, and the reports are peer-reviewed before publication. Such technical descriptions are critical because they show this is not speculation, but a layered, interdisciplinary finding. The documentary archive includes merchants' ledgers that show fluctuating prices for persons against grain indexes. A trader named Senin wrote in a private ledger that a healthy adult could fetch the equivalent of 2 years of a laborer's harvest yield during peak seasons. Conversely, during lean times, the price collapsed. This commodification tied human lives to market volatility. The social consequence was that an economic downturn could precipitate increased seizures and sales, just as a poor harvest could motivate a local bailiff to clear debts by requisitioning people. One central figure in this narrative is the provincial governor who orchestrated much of the seizure. He is not anonymous here. He is referred to in petitions as Nebseni. Nebseni owned shipments, licensed markets, and enjoyed exemptions. He used ritual to validate his actions, sometimes donating part of the proceeds to temple treasuries with the effect of sanctifying his revenues. 3 secondary administrators are named across sources: Ameni, the guard who appraised bodies, Tanenu, the clerk who kept the ledgers, and Rek, the buyer who transacted with ritual tokens. Their interactions reveal the division of labor that made the enterprise efficient and durable. Moments of tension punctuate the record. One such moment involved a confrontation when a priest objected to the sale of captives taken from a shrine precinct. The priest argued that the temple protected those who sought sanctuary. The governor responded by producing an order that consecrated the seizure under the rubric of tax recovery. The priest tried to halt the caravan and was physically ejected. The sensory detail is acute. The priest smelled of sandalwood. His robe rustled against stone. The crack of a staff against a shield echoed. The crowd watched in a hush. He shouted, "You remove the sacred and seal us with shame." The governor delivered a cold reply. Sacredness does not feed the state. The echo of that moment shows moral conflict between spiritual claims and fiscal demands. Another tension occurred when an inspected shipment carried a child of a local notable, provoking a legal appeal and a rare reprieve. And a final moment of tension came when a scribe leaked names to a sympathetic household and had to flee. The epilogue unfolds in 3 temporal moves. 1 month later, community mourning rituals attempted to reconstruct what legal records had erased. In a small village by the Nile, women gathered to sing the names of the taken and to list lineages aloud in a ceremony the records ignored. They tied beads to a rope and passed it hand to hand, each bead representing a person. The act was quiet and humanizing. 3 months later, a team of scholars from a university published a paper compiling burial evidence and genetic snapshots that suggested a structured pattern of forced movement rather than isolated incidents. The paper included maps, radiocarbon dates, and a cautious estimate that some regions experienced sustained flows of captive labor over several generations. 6 months later, a community initiative resulted in a small memorial near an excavation site, where a plaque was placed that listed names where possible and languages of those communities. The memorial invited descendants to add their testimonies. The epilogue emphasizes continuity and action. Memory was restored not by paperwork alone, but by collective effort. The weight of all this is not simply in the horror, but in the structure. Slavery was not merely the work of cruel individuals, it was a knitted architecture of market, law, ritual, and geography. The remarkable thing that archaeology and genetics combined with textual study reveal is the deep interplay between those domains. Where you see a shipment ledger, you will often find a temple account that rationalizes revenue, and in the same strata, a burial with shackled marks. The conclusion is stark. The darkest desires of the powerful were often practical as well as symbolic. Desire sought labor, reproduction, and symbolic triumph. Law turned desire into policy. Memory has been uneven but not entirely lost. This story demands a response. Recognizing the past is not an exercise in blame alone. It is an invitation to craft forms of remembrance and reparation through research, monuments, and education. When historians, archaeologists, and communities work together, the silence can be pierced with names. We must be careful in our words. We do not claim to assign moral guilt to modern nations or
individuals for acts centuries past. We insist only that understanding the mechanisms that permitted these violations clarifies the relationship between power and suffering. If this reconstruction unsettled you, let the discomfort deepen into a commitment to know more. Subscribe if you want future episodes that will trace another market or open another ledger. If you have a local memory or a family story that resonates with this material, please share in the comments, beginning with "I was" and one word. Your participation helps keep these persons from being reduced to lists and ensures that memory remains communal. Neferetu, in the end, was buried in a marginal ditch outside a farmstead where records labeled her as labor lost to disease. The archaeologists who found her bones noted marks on wrists consistent with long-term restraint and a bead that matched the weave of a village tradition. That small object became a hinge for a wider narrative. Her story, as reconstructed here, moves from the intimate to the structural and back again. To remember her is to insist that the architecture of suffering be read and understood. Memory is a form of justice. If you want to deepen that project, view the related episode on market routes and genetic legacies. Do not let silence decide who they were.